Yeah, just a bit of, if you will, esoteric background. Now let's turn to the narrative of John 3 with John and Jesus and Nicodemus. The setting is in Jerusalem at Passover, one of the explicit references to Passover, and we've talked about the fact that there are three of them mentioned in the fourth gospel. Nicodemus is described as a leader of the Jews, a leading Pharisee, and he comes to Jesus by night. Why by night? Maybe he doesn't want anybody else to know that he's having this encounter with Jesus. He says he's attracted by the signs that Jesus has done. And we've talked a little bit in the past about the role of signs and how there seems to be recognition that in the Jesus tradition and in the general tradition out of which early Christianity comes, miraculous deeds could be called signs. But John has another layer of meaning that he wants to add to them. In any case, it's not insignificant that Nicodemus is attracted by the signs or the miracles that Jesus does, but he doesn't quite seem to get the discourse that Jesus is engaged in. And that, I think, reflects the move that the gospel as a whole is making, pushing characters within the text and readers of the text, too, to try to probe deeper and understand more fully what it is that Jesus is offering. Nicodemus, in any case, appears here in chapter 3, and he appears in two other cases in the gospel. One in chapter 7, where he's engaged in dialogue with members of the leadership in Jerusalem, and he makes a legal point saying that they shouldn't act precipitously against Jesus. And people wonder, my goodness, are you becoming a Galilean? Are you becoming a follower of Jesus? Well, is he or isn't he? He appears again in chapter 19 at the burial of Jesus, where he comes with an enormous amount of myrrh and aloes, fragrant stuff to anoint the body of Jesus before it's put in the tomb. Is that a kind of symbolic statement of his belief in Jesus? Or is it a focus on the fact that Jesus has died rather than a realization that that's not the end of the story? Whatever, there's a little ambiguity about Nicodemus, which raises an interesting issue in reading the gospel that critics these days have spent a lot of time worrying about, and that is the way in which characters are portrayed and developed in the gospel. It used to be the case that the gospel was seen as focusing primarily, if not exclusively, on the character of Jesus, and all the others were kind of flat figures making a particular point and not showing any development. Well, we know that this text is not going to develop characters the way a modern novel would, but is it simply the case that they're being used as ciphers, or is there some way of showing a fuller picture of a human being engaging with Jesus? And many people have pointed to Nicodemus and the way in which he emerges in these later chapters as a pointer in that direction, that we ought to pay attention to the way in which characters are portrayed and the way in which their interactions with Jesus develop over time. There may be a message being conveyed there. In any case, it's worth thinking about. In any case, Nicodemus comes on the scene and engages in a dialogue with Jesus, and the dialogue focuses on a Greek word that can have two meanings. The word is anothen, which can mean again or from above. And Nicodemus construes it in a simple physical way. How can I get into my mother's womb again, he asks, thinking of being born again in a simple physical fashion. But no, Jesus is using the term in another way, being born from above. And the audience probably gets the point. I don't think many people would be surprised. And they can, in some ways, we can, in some ways, laugh at Nicodemus a little bit. Boy, are you stupid. Why didn't you get that little point, that there's a deeper meaning to this word than you seem to be giving it? That phenomenon of reacting to a character in a dramatic scene like this is a prime example of dramatic irony. And we know that ancient dramatists used that and used it to great effect. Probably the most interesting and best known example of it would be the Bacchae of Euripides, the story about Dionysus coming to town and being resisted by the local king, Pentheus. Dionysus becomes, if you will, incarnate, visible to Pentheus, and engages him as if he were a human being. And we all understand, we, the audience, understand what's going on. Pentheus, of course, doesn't get it at all. And at the end of the day, he's torn apart because of his resistance to Dionysus. Well, that's a clear case of dramatic irony, and something like that is going on here. But anytime we see dramatic irony and we laugh at a character in a play or a story, we ought to pause and think, is there a kind of another level of irony going on? Is it clear that we get what's being said in the story? Or are we too, in some ways, like Nicodemus? I think we need to be aware of that in John, that there's often another complex layer of irony that's coming along. In any case, Jesus seems to be pointing to a different kind of birth and getting back into your mother's womb, a birth that involves water and spirit. And this is where the higher level of irony kicks in. So what is he talking about? Is he talking about baptism? The reference to water would seem to point in that direction. And there seems to be, throughout the gospel, allusions to Christian ritual activity. We'll see that again in a major way when we look at chapter 6 next week. And I suspect that there's probably an allusion going on here to the Christian ritual of baptism, and we'll see some confirmation of that, I think, when we look at the subsidiary diptychs. But there's something else being said about baptism, that the water in itself is not sufficient. It's water and spirit, and with spirit there comes something of the notion of belief. And belief and understanding of who Jesus is essential to rebirth, I think, is what John is saying. John doesn't deny the validity or importance of baptism, but says there's a dimension to it that you have to get. And he'll do the same thing when we engage in consideration of the Eucharist a little later on.